The wind comes first, not cold, wind. It moves across the Mongolian steppe at 60 kilometers per hour, unbroken by forest or hill, stripping heat from every surface it touches. Then the cold. Minus 40 degrees Celsius on an average winter night. Minus 50 degrees Celsius when the sky is clear and the stars burn like ice. At these temperatures, exposed skin freezes in under 5 minutes. Breath crystallizes before it leaves your mouth. Metal shatters. The wind keeps coming. This is the Eurasian steppe in winter, a grassland empire stretching thousands of kilometers, almost entirely treeless. No wood for walls, no timber for fuel, just grass, sky, and cold that kills. For over 1,000 years, Mongol families lived through these winters. They raised children, tended herds, slept warm enough to shed their heaviest layers inside their homes. Their shelter was a circle of felt and wood that could be packed onto 3 camels and rebuilt in 2 hours. To outside eyes, it looked like a tent, primitive, temporary. Vulnerable, it wasn't. The Mongolian GR was a microclimate machine. Shape, material, heat source, and placement worked together to defeat cold that would kill an unprepared human in hours. Modern engineers study its thermodynamics. Its design has remained unchanged for centuries because there's no way to improve it. This is the story of how nomads turned physics into shelter and survived winter at the edge of what the human body can endure. The steppe winter doesn't announce itself. It arrives in October, settles in by November, and doesn't let go until April. 5 months, sometimes 6. Start with the temperature. At minus 40 degrees Celsius, the moisture in your breath freezes the moment it leaves your mouth. Tiny ice crystals that locals call the whisper of the stars. Your lungs ache. Your eyes water and the tears freeze on your lashes. But minus 40 degrees Celsius is just what the air reads. It doesn't account for wind. Wind is what kills you. The steppe is open, thousands of kilometers of grassland with almost no natural windbreaks. Winter winds move unobstructed across the landscape, 40 to 60 kilometers per hour on average. But gusts can hit 100. This isn't weather you walk through. It's a physical force that knocks you sideways, finds every gap in your clothing, every exposed patch of skin. Wind at this speed creates wind chill that drops the felt temperature far below what any thermometer shows. At minus 40 degrees Celsius with 60-kilometer winds, your skin feels something closer to minus 70 degrees Celsius, frostbite in under 2 minutes. The wind does something else too. It strips heat from any object faster than still air ever could. Convective heat loss. A shelter has to do more than insulate. It can't present any weakness to the wind. No corner for it to catch. No gap for it to infiltrate. A small crack becomes a thermal hemorrhage. Then there's the resource problem. The steppe is grassland. Grass and nothing else for horizons in every direction. Trees exist only near rivers, and even then, sparsely. For people living here, wood was the most precious material, too valuable to waste on walls, too scarce to burn freely for heat. There was no option to build a log cabin and keep a massive fire roaring all winter. The Mongols had sheep, horses, yaks, and camels. They had wool and felt. They had dried dung for fuel. Compact, slow-burning, but limited. They had grass for fodder. They didn't have wood. So the shelter they built could be carried by pack animals and assembled by a single family in hours. The GR was the answer to that equation. But to understand why it worked, you have to understand what it was up against. The steppe winter wasn't just cold. It was a thermodynamic attack from multiple angles. Radiant cold from the ground, convective heat loss from wind, moisture condensation from breathing, and fuel scarcity that meant every bit of warmth had to be captured, held, and used with absolute efficiency. Human survival in this environment came down to engineering. The Mongolian word is jer. Not yurt, that's Turkic, borrowed by outsiders. Jer means home. The distinction matters because what nomads built on the winter steppe wasn't a tent. It was a portable fortress with thermal performance Western military shelters didn't match until the late 20th century. Stand outside one in winter, and you see a low dome of gray-white felt. Wind slides around its curved surface. Looks unremarkable. Step inside and the air is 30 degrees warmer than the killing cold 2 meters away. A small fire burns in the center. The felt doesn't freeze. Condensation doesn't form on the walls. Children sleep near the edges in light clothing. This didn't happen by accident. It solved an engineering problem with no room for error. The challenge was double-edged. The GER had to perform like a permanent structure while staying completely portable. A nomadic family moved 4 times a year following pasture. Spring, summer, autumn, and winter camps, each in different locations. The winter GER had to be dismantled, loaded onto camels or yaks, transported across frozen steppe, and rebuilt at the new site. 3 animals could carry the components. A family of 4 could assemble it in under 3 hours, even in bitter cold with stiff hands. But portability meant nothing if the structure failed thermally. The interior had to stay warm enough for survival, ideally 10 to 15 degrees Celsius, while outside temperatures hit minus 50 degrees Celsius. It had to withstand 100-kilometer wind gusts without collapsing. It had to vent smoke and moisture without losing heat. And it had to do all this burning minimal fuel, because fuel was scarce. Every element of the GR existed to serve these demands. Nothing was decorative. Nothing was tradition for tradition's sake. Each component, frame, felt, door, vent, stove placement, solved a specific physics problem. Remove any single piece, and the whole solution collapses. The frame was lattice, willow wood, flexible and strong, formed expandable diamond pattern walls called kana. These folded flat for transport and expanded into circular sections when erected. Roof poles, yuna, radiated from the central crown ring down to the lattice walls like spokes. The entire structure weighed less than 250 kilograms and had no nails, only leather bindings and friction joints. This frame did 2 things. First, it created the circular shape. Not oval, not polygonal, perfectly round, because a circle has the lowest surface area to volume ratio of any shape. Less surface area means less area for heat to escape through. The steppe wind hits a circular structure and flows around it with minimal resistance. Can't find corners or flat faces to push against. Pressure distributes evenly across the dome. There are no weak points. Second, the lattice allowed the felt to wrap the structure under tension, creating a taut skin with no gaps. Loose fabric flaps in wind and lets cold air in. Tension-stretched felt becomes a sealed, thermal envelope. The felt itself was where the system got clever. Sheep's wool processed through felting, a technique where wool fibers are moistened, heated, and compressed until they lock into a dense mat. The result is a material filled with millions of microscopic air pockets. Trapped air insulates well because air itself conducts heat poorly, and trapping it prevents convective movement. One layer of felt provided modest insulation, but the GR wasn't built with one layer. In summer, families used 2 or 3. In autumn, 5. In deep winter, 8 or 9, each layer adding thickness until the walls were 10 to 15 centimeters dense. This created an insulating barrier comparable to modern fiberglass batting, but breathable. Moisture vapor could pass through slowly, preventing condensation buildup that would freeze and destroy the insulation's effectiveness. The felt also shed water. Wool contains lanolin, a natural grease that makes it hydrophobic. Snow that landed on the GR's surface would melt slightly from interior warmth, but the water couldn't penetrate. It slid off or evaporated. and the system was adjustable. When a cold snap hit, the family added another felt layer, tied it down with ropes. When temperatures rose, they removed one. The GR could be tuned day by day to match conditions. Fixed structures can't do this. A log cabin has whatever insulation it was built with. The GR adapted. From every point on the edge, this placement mattered as much as the felt itself. Radiant heat spreads outward in all directions. Put a stove against a wall, and half that heat is wasted, absorbed by the barrier, lost outside. Place it in the center of a circle, and every bit radiates toward living space. The curved walls bounce heat back inward. There are no distant corners where cold air settles, no dead zones the warmth can't reach. The whole interior becomes a thermal sphere with the fire at its center. The central position created convection. Hot air from the stove rose toward the roof opening, lowering pressure near the floor. Cooler air, still warmer than outside, but cooler than the air at ceiling height, flowed along the floor toward the stove. This set up a circulation pattern that moved warmth continuously through the space, without fans or ducts. The air never went still. Cold pockets never formed. The fuel was usually argol, dried dung from sheep, horses, or yaks. Sounds primitive until you consider its properties. Dung burns slowly and steadily, producing consistent heat over hours instead of the quick flash of wood. It makes less smoke than wood, which matters in an enclosed space. And it was everywhere. Where wood was scarce enough to save for the frame, dung was abundant, collected and dried through warmer months, stockpiled for winter. A single load could burn through the night. Families banked the fire before sleep, cutting airflow so coals smoldered until morning. The felt held enough warmth that even with the fire reduced to embers, interior temperatures stayed survivable through the coldest hours before dawn. But heat generation was only half the problem. Without control over airflow, the GR would either suffocate its occupants or bleed warmth into the killing cold. The door was the first control point. Built low, typically 1.3 to 1.5 meters tall, small openings lose less heat when opened, and the cold air that does enter stays low to the ground, where the convection current pulls it toward the stove and warms it. The door always faced south, away from the prevailing northern winter winds. This protected the entrance from wind-driven snow and let the low winter sun hit the doorway directly during the brief daylight hours. The door was never left open long. Mongol families moved with efficiency, in and out quickly, the felt flap dropping back into place right away. In extreme cold, a second felt layer could be hung inside the door frame, creating an airlock effect. The roof vent, the tonneau, was the system's lung. This circular crown ring at the top of the roof served as the structural keystone where all the roof poles met. But its real job was ventilation. Smoke from the stove rose through it. Moisture from cooking, breathing, and bodies escaped through it. Without this vent, the interior would become unbreathable within hours. But an open hole in the roof at -50 degrees Celsius is a thermal disaster. So the tonneau was covered by a square felt flap, the yurt, controlled by ropes from inside. Wide open, it gave maximum ventilation. Partially closed, it balanced smoke exhaust with heat retention. Nearly sealed during blizzards or extreme cold, it kept warmth inside while allowing just enough airflow to prevent suffocation and moisture buildup. This adjustability mattered. Conditions on the steppe changed hour by hour. A calm -30 degrees Celsius night needed different ventilation than a -45 degrees Celsius night with 80-kilometer winds. The family watched the interior constantly. Too much smoke meant opening the vent wider. Too much cold meant closing it down. Condensation on the felt meant air wasn't moving enough. They tuned the system in real time, responding to what the shelter told them. The felt walls breathed, but slowly. Moisture vapor could pass through the wool fibers gradually, preventing condensation that would freeze into ice inside the insulation and ruin it. But this vapor movement was slow enough that it didn't create convective heat loss. The air itself wasn't moving through the walls, only individual water molecules working their way outward. This balance, breathable but not drafty, is hard to get right. Modern synthetic insulations often fail at it, either trapping moisture or letting too much air through. The geometry amplified everything. Because the space was circular and domed, heat naturally rose with the warmest air at the top, but the dome shape kept it from pooling uselessly at a peak. The curve guided it back down along the walls. The lattice frame and felt created a continuous thermal envelope with no seams, no joints where air could leak. Every piece braced against every other piece, making the structure stronger under wind while sealing it tighter. Shape, skin, and fire formed a closed system. The circle cut heat loss. The felt trapped warmth in millions of air pockets. The central stove generated and spread heat efficiently. The vents allowed control without waste. And the whole thing weighed little enough to carry, went up fast enough to build in a few hours, and cost nothing but materials the herders already had. Inside, a family could cook, sleep, and live through 5 months of winter that would kill an unprotected human in hours. Outside, the wind tore across emptiness at -50 degrees Celsius. The barrier between those two realities was 15 centimeters of felt and 1,000 years of working out what actually functions. The GR by itself wouldn't cut it. You can build a flawless shelter and still freeze if you put it in the wrong spot. The Mongols got this. They knew the land could work for you or against you, that the ground itself was part of the defense before felt even entered the picture. Winter survival started with where you set up. Mongol families didn't just drift around the steppe when winter came. They went to lieu, winter campsites they'd used for years, sometimes generations. These weren't random. They were picked through experience, through winters that worked and winters that didn't, through knowledge handed down about how wind and cold moved across specific ground. The main thing was blocking wind. On open steppe at -40 degrees Celsius, wind kills. But the steppe isn't all flat. There are shallow valleys, hillsides, rock formations, ridges. These create wind shadows, pockets where air slows down and the convective heat loss that strips warmth from your body drops off. Winter, camps sat in those shadows. You'd put your gear on the sheltered side of a hill, in a slight dip, or behind rocks that broke the northern wind. The terrain took the hit before the wind ever reached you. What made it through was weaker, maybe 30 kilometers per hour instead of 80. That difference kept you alive. The ground also held heat. South-facing slopes got more direct sun in winter. Rocky ground especially would soak up solar radiation during the short daylight and release it slowly at night. A gyre on that kind of slope sat on Earth a few degrees warmer. In extreme cold, a few degrees matter. Valleys gave protection, but you had to be careful. Cold air sinks. In deep, narrow valleys with no outlet, the coldest air pooled at the bottom overnight. Temperatures there could drop lower than the open steppe. Mongol families avoided those spots. They picked shallow valleys or partway up the sides where cold air could drain downhill instead of settling. Water access was necessary but risky. Livestock needed rivers or springs even in winter. But water creates its own weather. Humid air, fog, sometimes ice fog in extreme cold that coats everything and makes breathing rough. Camps went near water, not right next to it. Close enough to reach, but far enough to stay out of the moisture. Snow told you things. Where it piled up or got scoured away showed you wind patterns you couldn't see in summer. Bare patches meant wind was hitting hard there. Deep drifts marked sheltered zones or places where wind dropped what it carried from somewhere else. The best camp spots had moderate snow, enough to insulate the ground under the GR, but not so much that it meant wind was funneling through. Vegetation was another clue. Some grasses and shrubs only grew in protected microclimates. If you saw them, you knew that spot had less severe wind, that spring forage would come back earlier, that conditions were slightly less brutal. These plants worked as markers for the invisible, thermal landscape. Placement shifted too. Even within a known winter camp area, families moved their jur based on what was happening that season. If the wind changed direction, they'd relocate, sometimes just 30 or 40 meters, but enough to get back into the wind shadow. The GR being portable made this work. Something you could move in 3 hours could be repositioned when you needed to. This landscape knowledge was as technical as the GR's design. It meant understanding how air moves without equations, how heat works without instruments, how microclimates form without weather data. It was empirical science built through observation and held in spatial memory. This ridge blocks northwest wind. That low spot fills with cold air before dawn. This southern slope warms first when sun breaks through. The GR and the land worked together. The terrain cut wind and added marginal warmth. The GR's shape deflected what was left, and its felt walls held whatever heat you made. Inside, one without the other wasn't enough. Together, they created the margin that kept you alive. Every component mattered. Remove one, and the system collapsed. The circle deflected wind that would have ripped corners apart. The felt trapped heat that would have escaped through thinner walls. The central stove warmed space that couldn't have stayed livable with a corner firebox. The adjustable vent let smoke out while keeping warmth that an open hole would have drained. The terrain blocked wind that would have overpowered even the best insulation. These elements didn't work alone. The GR worked as one system, where each part strengthened the rest. Central heat only worked because the circular shape spread it evenly. Felt insulation only worked because the lattice frame kept it tight. Ventilation control only worked because the felt breathed slow enough to stop heat from rushing out. This meant precision. A GR built even slightly oval lost heat. Felt layers with gaps let cold through and wrecked the whole system. A stove placed off-center left cold spots. A camp set up without reading. The wind exposed the shelter to forces it couldn't handle. The Mongols had built a microclimate machine tuned exactly to the steppe, where survival came down to margins too narrow for mistakes. The GR looks the same today because there was never a reason to change it. Nearly half of Mongolia still lives in them, and it's not about tradition. It's because nothing works better. People tried other designs. They went back to the GR. This was never primitive. It was a solution that came from centuries of cold mornings and dead fires, from watching where snow piled and where it didn't. Physics shaped it as much as any craftsman. Engineers still study the ventilation, the weight distribution, the way heat moves through layered felt. The Mongols built it right the first time, in a place that didn't forgive second drafts.